Good morning again. Again, I'm Eugene. I'm one of the pastors here. And if you are just joining us, we have been in a summer sermon series called Awkward, Parts of the Bible We Avoid. And we have been taking a look at some passages in the New Testament in particular that might seem strange or even offensive to modern readers like ourselves. And so sometimes it takes just a little extra effort or a little extra work to get at the real meaning underneath all of the awkwardness. And today, I want to talk about what is perhaps one of the most awkward parts about being a Christian these days. And no, I don't mean those old, awkward Christian music album covers you find on the internet. I don't even know what's happening in that last one. And no, I am not talking about bad Christian puns. By the way, is it hot in here? It's weird. It really shouldn't be because this church is prayer conditioned. I'm not talking about the slightly embarrassing or cringy humor, kind of awkward like we just had. But something actually much more serious. I'm talking about the awkward tendency for Christians to think it's their job in the world to judge and condemn others and to tell everyone else what they should and shouldn't be doing. According to a Barna research study a number of years ago, when non-Christians under the age of 30 were asked to describe Christians, the most frequently used words were judgmental, hypocritical, close-minded, insensitive, and critical. That's pretty sad in and of itself, but what's even sadder is that none of us are probably surprised. I'd be willing to bet that in recent years, that negative impression has only gotten worse. See, Christians are supposed to be some of the most loving and compassionate people on earth, right? We're supposed to have good news to share with the world, right? Then why is it that people generally have the complete opposite impression of what we would hope for? It's awkward because I believe many Christians are motivated by genuine love and concern for others. But somehow, something is either getting lost in translation, or perhaps there's some way that we've gotten the message itself wrong. We want to embody and proclaim a gospel, good news about God's amazing grace and unconditional acceptance for all people, no matter who they are, where they're from, and what they have done. We want to share good news that's actually good news. But then inevitably, some well-meaning Christian will remind us all, but Jesus said, go and sin no more. And then we all say, oh yeah, that's right. And then we flip back to being judgmental and trying to warn everybody to just stop sinning. It's confusing, isn't it? We maintain that Jesus forgives and loves unconditionally, but at the same time doesn't excuse or condone sin or immorality. And so we get stuck in this dilemma between grace and guilt, forgiveness and justice. And since our rational minds just have a hard time holding these opposites in tension, we inevitably just toggle back and forth between the two, or just choose one over the other. Either we become one of those Christians who really emphasizes God's unconditional grace and acceptance, or one who emphasizes God's call to obedience and holiness. We want to take sin and its harmful effects seriously, but we also want to demonstrate God's mercy and grace and his infinite patience. We want to say, come as you are, but also repent. You have to change who you are. How do we do both? How do we fight sin and forgive it at the same time? It's a mystery. Some might say, love the sinner, but hate the sin. I'm sorry, I've never heard of anyone who heard that and said, wow, really? Thank you so much. That's really sweet of you. That's awkward. How would you feel if I were just start going around telling you, hey, stop sinning, okay? Hey, you stop sinning. And you in the back, yeah, especially you really need to stop sinning. We usually end our services with a charge that goes something like, go in peace to love and serve the Lord. What if, let's just change that, okay? Let's just go with the words of Jesus. Go and sin no more. It would be awkward, right? Why? Because we all know it's not that simple. One does not simply say to an addict, just stop drinking. Or to a greedy person, just stop loving money so much. Or to a narcissist, just stop being so selfish. Or to a victim of trauma or abuse, just stop being so bitter. Or to any weak and wounded sinner like me and like you, just go and sin no more. Like so many other scriptures, I believe Christians have taken these words out of context and misused them to justify legalism and to shame and guilt others. And so today, in order to consider what Jesus really means by these words, we're going to look at one of my all-time favorite encounters of Jesus in the Bible. In it, we find Jesus, and it's early in the morning in the temple courts where a crowd of people have gathered around him to listen to him teach, when suddenly there is a big commotion. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees bring this woman who had just been caught in the act of adultery, which is pretty awkward, and they force her to stand before the crowd. And they say to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" And even though it's quite obvious, John provides some commentary so that there is no mistaking their motives. They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing Jesus. And so first off, I want to make a few observations. First, it is very strange, a little fishy, that although the woman was caught in the act of committing adultery, which usually requires two to tango, right? Only the woman is brought in front of this crowd. We don't know what happened. Maybe the man got away. Maybe they let him get away. Or in a worst case scenario, and one possible reason why there is no man brought forth here, is that she had been raped, but now stands accused of adultery. Maybe this whole thing is a setup. We don't really know. What we do know is in Jesus' time, women had very few rights, and they were basically treated like property. Their testimony was not permitted in Jewish law. They had virtually no legal protections. So even if this woman is guilty or innocent, it seems in this case there will be no trial, no defense, not even a witness. This woman is completely at the mercy of the men in charge. And so what are the teachers and Pharisees of the law up to? By this time, they're already plotting to find a way to dispose of Jesus. And it seems like they have laid the perfect trap. See, by Jewish law, adulterers were required to be put to death. But the Jews were under Roman occupation, and they weren't allowed to simply carry out their own executions. You know, the Romans, if anyone's going to execute anybody, it's going to be them, right? They're a little possessive of that. Which is why, it makes sense, later, the Jewish leaders asked Pontius Pilate to execute Jesus, and they didn't just do it on their own. And so Jesus is given this choice. Either side with the Jewish law, instruct the mob to stone this woman and get in trouble by the Roman authorities, or let her go. But then he would seem to be ignoring the Jewish law and get him in trouble by all the Jews who are so eager to follow him. It's a classic catch-22, right? He's stuck between a rock and a hard place. John then provides this fascinating detail. The Pharisees and teachers of the law had just caused this huge commotion, confronting Jesus in public with this seemingly impossible dilemma. And what does Jesus do? He just stoops down and he starts to write on the ground with his finger. And there's been ample speculation about what this signifies, and what was Jesus writing on the ground? Was he just doodling, right? Or did he write out the secret sins of the accusers? One possibility that I particularly like is that he was writing the words of the 10 Commandments in the sand. Because there is only one other instance in the Bible when God writes with his finger, and it's when God inscribed the 2 tablets of the covenant law. Wouldn't it be cool if Jesus is like, you're challenging me about the law? I wrote the law, right? But who knows? Whatever it was that he wrote on the ground, I'm just struck by his body language alone here. It's as if he's not going to be bothered or get drawn into the fray. It's like he's not interested in playing these petty games. But they continue to question him until finally he straightens up and he says just one sentence that silences them all. He says, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." And then he stooped down again and continued writing on the ground with his finger. Jesus is the coolest, right? Right? With these simple words, Jesus does something each of us here today need to pay attention to. What he's doing is he's forcing the Pharisees and teachers of the law to look at the sinner from the perspective of their own sinfulness. He makes them see the sinner in light of their own sin. And at this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. Perhaps the elders, right, having gained some wisdom from their years, were first to realize that they were less than perfect. And then the younger men, one by one, until it was only Jesus left with this woman standing before him. Friends, despite whatever heading might be in your Bible and on top of this passage, this story is not about a woman caught in adultery. The real sin in this story is something far more disturbing and evil. But we might miss it if we are not paying attention. Most of us do not have any concept of what a stoning is, but it is a public execution, not unlike a lynching. See, during this time, the victim or scapegoat would be thrown into a ditch or sometimes partially buried while a mob threw stones of various sizes down at the person until they were dead. And because no single stone is likely to be enough to kill a person, responsibility for the killing gets distributed amongst the mob. This way, no one person can be held accountable. Each person only threw a couple stones. So let's be crystal clear here. This is what these men would like to see happen here. A brutal public participation murder. And in this particular instance, it's about the singling out of a particularly vulnerable person. We don't know the exact nature of her sin or guilt, but it doesn't seem to matter much because she is the perfect victim. She has no voice. She has no defender. These men may have had this added motive of trapping Jesus, but what is far more disturbing is that they seem to have no qualms about using punishment and violence as the solution to sin. They actually believed that they were righteous in doing so. We shouldn't be surprised, at least anymore, at the human capacity to deny our own wrong while persecuting the wrongs of others. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say lawmakers and ICE agents, they might feel right and justified in arresting hundreds of undocumented workers in Mississippi. But they are also, at the same time, really, really wrong in the irreparable harm and trauma they are causing these families and children. There must be a better, more merciful, more humane way. Back to the story. After all her accusers left, Jesus straightened up once again, and he asks her, maybe her eyes are closed, right? Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? No one, sir. Then neither do I condemn you, Jesus declared. And there it is. There it is. This is what Jesus does with sin. The only one who could have thrown a stone, the only one who was actually without sin, did not condemn her. He frees her. But you might say, yeah, but Jesus also says, go now and leave your life of sin. He tells her to stop sinning. Good point. But let's consider what he might have meant by this. Older translations will still say the words that are familiar to many of us, go and sin no more, which is actually the more straightforward translation from the Greek. But many newer translations have updated that to read differently. It says, go now and leave your life of sin. It captures a different meaning. Just consider this. If Jesus really meant it literally, to go and sin no more, then I guess the next natural question for all of us should be, do you think she did? Do you think she never sinned again? Is that what Jesus is asking here? Or would that have even mattered to Jesus? Was this an actual command or expectation? In my view, it is hard to imagine, given what has just happened, right, that this is what Jesus meant. It seems far more likely that what Jesus is saying is, go now and leave your life of sin. Meaning, whatever situation you are in that got you into this dangerous predicament, get out, change. We don't know enough about her backstory to arrive at any conclusions, but it seems far more likely to me that Jesus here is expressing compassion and care for this woman, not placing more expectations and burden on her. He's saying, go, you're free. You have a second chance to live this new life. He's not giving her more guilt, he's giving her grace. See, as readers, we are supposed to see what's really happening here. We're supposed to see that the accusers here are not innocent. Jesus makes that really clear. We're supposed to see that they are the guilty ones. guilty of self-righteousness and judgment and oppression of the weak and dishonesty and violence and murderous intent. We're supposed to see this woman exposed and vulnerable and defenseless, standing in shame before her community, bent on killing her in order to maintain and protect the illusion of their own righteousness. And in the midst of all this, we are supposed to see Jesus. We're supposed to see Jesus full of wisdom and grace. See, those who use these words, Jesus said, go and sin no more. Those who use these words of Jesus, spoken in mercy to this woman, as a way of enforcing their own self-selected standards of moralism on others, are missing the entire point of the passage. You can't use a passage that explicitly rejects judgment and condemnation to legitimize more judgment and condemnation. But don't just take my word for it. Let's listen to Jesus, right? He says, do not judge, for you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there is a plank in your own? Or how about James? Speak and act as those who are going to be judged by the law that gives freedom, because judgment without mercy will be shown to anyone who has not been merciful. Mercy triumphs over judgment. Or how about Paul? You, therefore, have no excuse, you who pass judgment on someone else, for at whatever point you judge another, you are condemning yourself, because you who pass judgment do the same things. As it is written, there is no one righteous, not even one. Mother Teresa also puts it very succinctly. And she says, if we judge others, we will have no room to love them. Jesus, James, and Paul, they're all saying the same thing. And it's hard for us to absorb. But we are all always, at the same time, part sinner and part victim. We all need to apologize, and we all need to forgive. And if the one who is sinless chose mercy and love instead of judgment and condemnation, then we who are sinful must surely change the way we think about and handle sin. We need to move. Christianity needs to move from an understanding of justice that is punitive to one that is restorative. We need to move from condemnation to compassion. We need to move from a worldly, works and merit-based religion to a grace-based kingdom of love offered freely to imperfect sinners like all of us here. We are all the same in God's eyes, just children in need of love. Brothers and sisters, what if the real reason people do not hear what Christians have to say as good news is that they're not dumb? They can sense when we think we're better than them. It's almost impossible to truly love someone when you think you're superior to them. We need to move. We need to shift from our positions of superiority to solidarity. After all, isn't that the way of Jesus? Is he not the very Son of God who came to live among us in solidarity with our weakness and our suffering? Remember, the people who crucified Jesus were the ones who are trying to enforce their standards of right and wrong, of moral purity, separating the sinners from the saints, the good guys and the bad guys. It's the people holding on to their position of power who saw Jesus' radical message of love as a threat to their established hierarchy. Wouldn't it be amazing if Christians were known because we actually had good news to offer the world? That we had a message of hope and healing and reconciliation. That we actually had a remedy for the hate and polarization that's ripping our world apart. Wouldn't it be amazing if the world knew us by our love? But in order for that to happen, we must change our whole orientation towards sin and towards others. We have to be about humility and restoration, not blame and punishment. We have to be about freedom and love, not control and fear. We have to be about healing and forgiveness, not more pain and division and isolation and oppression, and certainly not casting stones at others. We have to be about love because love alone has the power to heal. Love alone has the power to transform. Love alone is the solution to sin. How does this work out in our daily lives? Well, like so many other things, I don't have the answer. Like so many other things in the spiritual journey, we need wisdom. This is a wisdom problem. See, rules are easy. Wisdom is hard. Wisdom requires humility and a dependence on the Holy Spirit. And we only learn it by stumbling around and getting it wrong a lot of the time. Only a fool thinks that they're right all the time. The wise always see their brokenness and shortcomings first. Fools settle for easy answers and quick judgments. The wise say, I'm probably missing something, I'm getting it wrong in some way, but this is the best I can do. Lord, have mercy. Right? So what do we do? What do we do with sin? As I said before, of course, it depends, right? It depends on the situation and what kind of sin it is. That's why we need wisdom. There's no manual, there's no answer book. But that being said, so much depends on how we are seeing things, and we can learn a thing or two. We can learn two guiding principles, at least, from the passage that we've just studied. First, in the same way that Jesus challenged the woman's accusers, we need to always, always, always see the sins of others through the lens of our own sinfulness. This is what Jesus means by taking the plank out of your own eye before trying to remove the speck from your brother's eye. See, Christians have had a tendency to elevate a particular sin of others, usually one that they don't personally struggle with. They'll elevate that particular sin so that they can feel justified and perhaps continue to ignore all the ways that they themselves are sinful and disobedient. It's a kind of spiritual farsightedness, right? Always able to see the sins of others ever so clearly while being blind to our own sins right in front of us. And so the first guide is for us to look at sin in the light of our own. Whenever I'm convinced that my wife is just wrong and unaware of how blind she is to the truth, I need to stop and remember the one or two times I've been wrong in my life. When we are able to see the other's weakness in light of our own, not only will we be able to see more clearly, we might be able to grow in humility and compassion and understanding, which is the whole point. When we do this, I believe we will learn the power of vulnerability. In a disagreement, we might learn to see the other not as an opponent, but as a whole person, a sister or brother in need of grace and empathy, the same way that we all do. The second guiding principle we can learn from how Jesus deals with this woman's sin is to look for the way of love and restoration. Is to look for the way of love and restoration, not condemnation and punishment. See, when my kids step out of line or make some poor choices, my goal is not to punish or to alienate them further. My goal is to lovingly guide them back into harmony with themselves and with others. Of course, that sometimes means that there are consequences, but they are always with the intention of restoring and repairing what was broken, not just inflicting pain and punishment. In a now well-known TED Talk titled, "Everything You Think You Know About Addiction Is Wrong," journalist Johann Hari states that the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, but connection. In other words, the antidote to addiction, in order to break free of addiction, it has less to do with willpower than it has with the ability to experience love and connection with others. And in light of how God responds to us in our sinfulness, doesn't that make perfect sense? So much of our sin is not the result of us being bad. That's too easy. That's too simple. It's the result of us being empty and alone and hungry for love and safety and acceptance. The solution to sin is not punishment and isolation, but reconciliation and restoration. The solution to sin is not more shame and guilt, but more love and grace. In Victor Hugo's novel Les Miserables, which, by the way, is still my favorite musical of all time, the protagonist, Jean Valjean, experiences this powerful transformation when he encounters grace for the first time. I know many of us are familiar with this story, but I'm going to recount it for us anyway, because it is such a profound illustration of grace. After serving these 19 years of hard labor for stealing a loaf of bread, Valjean is welcomed and taken in by this bishop who sees him not as a thief, not as a vagrant, but as a brother, as a human being in need of kindness and love. And so he welcomes him into his home. But in a moment of fear and weakness, Jean Valjean steals the bishop's silver in the middle of the night, and he runs away, only to be caught the next morning and dragged back to the bishop's home by the police. But when the bishop sees Jean Valjean, he immediately says this, and this is from the novel. He says, here you are. I'm not going to sing the musical part, okay? He says, I am glad to see you. Well, but how is this? I gave you the candlesticks too, which are of silver like the rest, and for which you can certainly get 200 francs. Why did you not carry them away with your forks and spoons? The way of love and restoration. See, the bishop gives Valjean everything, and he orders the man to release him. But before he sends him off, he leans in and he says these words to him in a low voice. Jean Valjean, my brother, you no longer belong to evil, but to good. Essentially, he says to him, go and sin no more. I restore you. I free you from darkness and from sin. And Jean Valjean experiences grace, and he is never the same again. We don't know what happened to the woman caught in adultery, but I have to say, it would be impossible for her not to be changed. This is how God does it. This is how God deals with sinners like us. So how will you deal with sin? Have you ever experienced grace like this before? Perhaps you might remember that grace and receive it anew today, and then tomorrow again, and the day after that, and so on. And here's a clue. You'll know that you're growing in grace if it makes you more and more humble and gracious to others. Perhaps there's someone in your life right now in need of this grace. How might you see their sin in light of your own? How might you ask for wisdom and look for the way of love and restoration? Perhaps you need to confess and repent of some of the ways that you have judged and condemned others. Who have you written off or looked down upon? Who have you felt superior to? Or perhaps you are the one who feels judged and condemned. Maybe you feel disconnected from God, or you're under the weight of guilt and shame. If you are in need of grace right now, I want you to know that God already knows you, loves you, and offers His grace to you freely. There's nothing you need to do to earn it or deserve it. There's nothing you need to do but open your heart to Him in faith and choose to believe this good news. I want to invite us to take a few moments in silence now to be listening to God and to respond to Him in whatever way that we need to today. And then in a few moments, we will come to Him together in confession and the assurance of His forgiveness.